protests across the United Kingdom. These are images that we're getting to you from different parts. Demonstrations turned violent in London as protesters clashed with the police. Glass bottles, traffic cones and crackers were thrown at lines of police personnel along the Whitehall and in Parliament Square. One person was arrested after protesters clashed with the police outside the Foreign Office as well. Demonstrations also took place in front of the American Embassy.
No! Justice! No! Justice! No! Justice!
Remember, the Black Lives Matter protest began after an unarmed African-American man, George Floyd, was killed by the police in the U.S. state of Minneapolis. And since then, the protests have spread on to different parts of the world. The attack on the police prompted a harsh reaction from Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who said that the protests have been subverted by thuggery. Massive protests also took place in Glasgow, where thousands of people demanded an end to racism. The UK Home Secretary Priti Patel said that the protests should stop due to the violence as well as the coronavirus pandemic.
Again, as I did yesterday, for people to not protest, to follow the rules that are in place, because those rules are there and they are designed to protect the NHS and save lives. And quite frankly, the appalling levels of violence that we saw yesterday are unacceptable. I'm pretty certain that the British public would agree with me that what we saw was completely wrong. It is shameful. And quite frankly, that is why these protests should stop and they should not go ahead. And people must be mindful and stick with the rules that have been put in place.
Meanwhile, protesters in London also vandalized properties that they associated with racism. This included the statue of Winston Churchill, who was the UK's Prime Minister during World War II. Churchill's legacy has been marred by his white supremacist views and the 1943 Bengal famine. On to Bristol now, where anti-racism protesters threw the statue of 17th century slave trader Edward Colston into a river. And joining us live on the broadcast this minute is our London Bureau Chief, Mandy Clark, for more on all of that. Mandy, give us a better sense of the reactions that have come in from the UK leadership to those protests that are only swelling in number.
Yes, what was interesting is specifically during the Bristol incident, the police made a tactical decision and said they were not going to actually stop what was happening. They felt that it would put more lives at risk. They understood the anger, so they ultimately let it happen, even though the police were surrounding the area. Behind me is the Churchill statue where it was graffitied yesterday. That graffiti has already been removed. It is surrounded by police because Churchill has a legacy of being a wartime prime minister. When it was graffitied, it was the 76th anniversary of D-Day. So that has led to a number of people being quite angry that they chose Churchill to desecrate the memorial on D-Day. Of course, there is many cases where Churchill did have a legacy of racism, and that's the point of what they were making yesterday. So this one has been slightly more controversial, and there is a police presence around the Churchill Memorial. But very much the feeling in Bristol is the bigger question is, why was there a statue of a slave trader in the first place, and why did it take the protest to remove it?
Right, and do we expect to have more such protests taking place for the rest of the week? What are the protesters saying at this point?
So the well-organized Black Lives Matter protests haven't had anything planned. It was over the weekend where they demonstrated outside the U.S. Embassy. We are seeing small gatherings of people showing up to iconic places, but nothing specifically large numbers planned by the movement itself. But overall, there's a feeling that there needs to be a step change in the way that Britain deals with its colonial past and the history that it entails.
All right, we're going to leave it there for the moment, Mandy. Thanks very much for those updates. We'll, of course, keep coming back to you.